He wants to denazify and demilitarize Ukraine. Putin announces the Russian invasion with a bizarre sweeping. The Kremlin boss threatens anyone who dares to interfere with unprecedented consequences. So Russia has started attacking Ukraine. The situation is confusing. Attacks are being reported from several areas. Russian President Vladimir Putin previously announced the military actions in a televised address. This topic will of course dominate this magazine, even if there are other topics as well. But one must not forget that Putin has been waging a war against Ukraine in violation of international law for 8 years. And the invasion of Crimea was the first. Only now he has started the second large-scale invasion. A change of power in Ukraine more than 8 years ago sparked the conflict with Russia. Since then, the neighbors' crisis has continued to worsen. According to UN estimates, more than 14,000 people have died so far, most of them in the separatist areas. And I just want to give you a quick review of what happened. In December 2013, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians protested in the capital Kiev against pro-Russian President Viktor Yanukovych because his government overturned the partnership agreement with the EU. The Independence Square, the Maidan, becomes a symbol. In February 2014, Yanukovych flees to Russia. Moscow militarily occupies the Ukrainian Black Sea peninsula of Crimea. And in March 2014, Russia holds an internationally unrecognized referendum in Crimea and incorporates it as part of the country. The US and the EU imposed sanctions on Moscow. And in April 2014, in the eastern Ukrainian regions of Donbas, Moscow-backed separatists proclaimed the Donetsk People Republic, followed by Luhansk. The Western Defense Alliance NATO is suspending its military cooperation with Russia because of the Crimean crisis. June 2014. In eastern Ukraine, rebels shot down a military plane during a night landing maneuver at Luhansk airport. All 49 soldiers on board are killed. July 2014. A Malaysia Airlines passenger plane is allegedly shot down by a Russian missile over the separatist areas. All 298 people on board die. The West is tightening its sanctions against Russia. October 2014. The Ukrainian parliament grants special status to the Donetsk and Luhansk regions as part of the peace plan for eastern Ukraine. Their rights to self-government should be strengthened. November 2014. The eastern Ukrainian separatists have their own parliaments elected for the first time. Kiev condemns this as unconstitutional. December 2014. NATO wants to permanently have soldiers ready in the east of the alliance. In addition, a rapid reaction force will be set up with up to 40,000 soldiers. February 2015. The Minsk Agreement provides autonomy for the separatist areas and Ukraine's control of its border with Russia. September 2015. Ukraine's Security Council officially declares neighboring Russia an enemy in a military doctrine. July 2017. The pro-Russian separatists in Luhansk and Donetsk unilaterally proclaim their new state, Little Russia. September 2017. Ukraine's association agreement with the EU enters into force. January 2018. Kiev classifies the breakaway territories in the east as occupied by Russia. March 2018. After Nord Stream 1 has been transporting gas from Russia through the Baltic Sea to Germany since 2011, work on the controversial Baltic Sea pipeline Nord Stream 2 begins. November 2018. The Russian Coast Guard detains 3 Ukrainian Navy ships with 24 sailors on board in the Kerch Strait. Kiev temporarily declares martial law. Elections held in the separatist areas are not recognized internationally. June 2019. First Russian passports are issued to Ukrainians in separatist-controlled parts of the Donbas region. April 2021. Moscow is massing troops in the border area with eastern Ukraine and is threatening military intervention. Russia's military doctrine allows for intervention to protect its citizens abroad. July 2021. Putin writes in an essay that Russians and Ukrainians are one people. This is read as a claim on the neighbor. September 2021. The multi-billion-dollar Russian prestige project Nord Stream 2 is completed. In the future, the pipeline is supposed to deliver 55 billion cubic meters of gas per year to Germany. In November, the Federal Network Agency temporarily suspended its approval process. November 2021, once again, unusually large contingents of troops and modern weapons are concentrated in the Russian border area with Ukraine. The West later speaks of up to 150,000 soldiers. December 2021, Ukraine accuses Germany of blocking arms deliveries. Berlin maintains its no. Russia demands from NATO again, Ukraine must not become a member. January 2022, diplomatic attempts at various levels, such as bilateral US-Russian talks, the NATO-Russia Council, or a meeting of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, still do not bring a solution. February 15th, during his meeting with Putin in Moscow, Chancellor Olaf Scholz again threatened far-reaching consequences if Russia took military action against Ukraine. Meanwhile, the Russian parliament, the State Duma, is calling on Putin to recognize the Ukrainian separatist areas as independent people's republics. February 16th, NATO defense ministers approved preparations for sending more combat troops to the alliance eastern territory. In addition to the previous associations in Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia and Poland, they could be stationed in Eastern and Southeastern Europe. February 19th. The German federal government urgently calls on all Germans to leave Ukraine. Other states do that too. February 21st. Putin recognizes the self-proclaimed People's Republics of Luhansk and Donetsk as independent states, and the State Duma agrees the following days. In addition, Russian soldiers are to be sent to the eastern Ukrainian separatist areas. February 22nd, US and EU and allies impose punitive measures against Russia. For example, Berlin is putting the Nord Stream 2 Baltic Sea gas pipeline on hold for an indefinite period. The sanctions are aimed, for example, at banks, business people and decision makers who support Putin's policies. The president himself is not on the list. February 23rd, the Security Council of Ukraine announces a state of emergency for the entire country for 30 days. And February 24th, Russia launches a massive attack on Ukraine, which is still ongoing. They now get the big stage in the Kremlin in Moscow, the separatists in eastern Ukraine. 8 years ago, they claimed the self-proclaimed People's Republics, but what is their goal? Since April 2014, the separatists have controlled parts of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions and are fighting against the Ukrainian government's army. And Russia's President Vladimir Putin has now recognized the self-proclaimed People's Republics as independent, triggering fierce criticism in the West. Independence is only an intermediate goal of the insurgents on the way to joining Russia. In the turmoil following the fall of the Western government in February 2014 in Kiev, the Russian-speaking demonstrators in the heavy industry and mining region in the east initially primarily demanded linguistic and economic self-determination within the country. After Moscow annexed the Black Sea Peninsula of Crimea in 2014, complete independence of the two regions from Kiev was quickly announced. The goal is a connection to the neighboring country. However, a peace plan for the Donbas negotiated by Berlin and Paris does not provide for this. In the beginning, the separatists were often led by Russians like ex-spy Igor Girkin or current Russian MP Alexander Borodai. Later, visible positions were occupied by local people. The Luhansk separatists are led by former Secret Service agent Leonid Pasechnik. Denis Pushilin is the boss in the separatist area of Donetsk. Kiev had already classified the area as Russian-occupied before the Kremlin recognized them. Kiev has lost more than 400 kilometers of its borders with Russia between the Azov Sea and the Siversky Donetsk River to the insurgents. More than 420 kilometers of front line with several crossing points separates the region from the government area. Due to a Ukrainian economic blockade, the supply runs exclusively via the Russian border with several road and rail crossings. The delivery of supplies was also documented in a sensational court decision in the neighboring Russian region of Rostov. Ukrainian military intelligence estimates the separate forces to be around 35,000 strong. The locals serving on contract bases are led and trained by around 3,000 Russian officers. However, the well-known rebel commander Alexander Khodorkovsky, a former officer in the Ukrainian Secret Service, recently emphasized that these numbers would not be reached by a long shot. Activists share photos of Russian troops on the Ukrainian border on social media. A Z is emblazoned on many tanks and trucks. Experts are alarmed. The character Z does not exist in the Cyrillic alphabet, but the letter is a common sight on Russian tanks and trucks around Ukraine, painted in white paint on the side doors or rear panels, often in a white square. Western observers are now puzzling over what the letter is all about. It looks like the Russian troops near the border are marking their vehicles with a Z to distinguish their combat units, military expert Rob Lee wrote on Twitter. The background could be that the Ukrainian army still uses many vehicles from Soviet times, but that is not certain. Analyst Eric Tolle tweeted about possible interpretations of the symbol, all of which seem pretty arbitrary, from Lukashenko as the self-proclaimed leader of the unrecognized Donetsk People's Republic to Zayin, the Phoenician word for sword. I don't know why so many people think they know what the Z stands for, Tolle writes. I don't know myself, but if I had to say something, I would say it's a simple symbol to distinguish a combat group. The task of this group? Use your imagination. Analyst Ruslan Leviev makes a similar statement. The Z can be used to protect their own vehicles from being fired upon by their own troops, he writes on Twitter and adds, but we see a lot of movement of vehicles every day, and that Z is very rare. Eric Tolle writes, Ruslan has been dealing with these things for 8 years and hasn't seen the Z either. We should assume the worst. Many videos and pictures of Russian troops with the Z mark can now be found on Twitter. More and more politicians are condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine. However, China is now siding with President Putin and blames the West for the escalation. According to information from Moscow, Russia and China blame the USA and Ukraine for the military escalation. The ministers expressed their common belief that the reason for the current crisis is Kiev's refusal, encouraged by the United States and its allies, to implement the Minsk package of measures approved by the UN Security Council, the Foreign Ministry said in Moscow. This was preceded by a conversation between Department head Sergei Lavrov and his Chinese colleague Wang Yi. Russia and China insisted that all countries respect the principle of undivided security. Yeah, like Ukraine's? Russia claims the Russian attack in Ukraine is to protect people in the eastern Ukrainian separatist areas. According to Chinese state broadcaster CCTV, Wang said China has always respected the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries. At the same time, however, the Ukraine question has complex and special historical aspects. Should we talk about history seriously? Then we all speak Latin now. We understand Russia's legitimate concerns about security issues, they say. China advocates abandoning the Cold War mentality completely and finally forming a balanced, effective and sustainable European security mechanism through dialogue and negotiations. Yeah, the only one who didn't want that is Putin. The Russian army has invaded Ukraine, is already advancing on the capital, Kiev. Austria's chancellor spoke to President Selenskyj on the phone and reported great concerns. According to Austria's Chancellor Karl Nehammer, Ukraine fears for its existence as a state. At a press conference, Nehammer described the content of a phone call with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. He not only fears the continued existence of Ukraine, but also for his life and that of his fellow citizens. According to the reports, there is heavy fighting in Ukraine. There are many dead and the civilian infrastructure is affected. German stations even pulled out the journalists today. Nehammer accused Russia of violating international law. Moscow does not claim the strength of the law, but the law of the strongest. As a neutral country within the European Union, Austria deeply rejects this, said the federal chancellor. Austria attaches great importance to international law, precisely because the country is militarily neutral. Nehammer emphasized that a unified approach by the Europeans with sanctions is now important. However, the thread of the conversation should not be lost. In a time of death, and that is war, unfortunately the weapons speak more than the diplomats. That has to be reversed, said Nehammer. He announced that he wanted to help any Ukrainian refugees. We will stand by the countries that are directly affected, he said, referring to possible refugee movements to neighboring countries such as Poland. The people who sought protection should be helped in a neighborly manner. The basics should be in place. The EU states are planning new sanctions after Russia invaded Ukraine. They are reportedly targeting 3 key areas in particular. According to information from the German press agency, the EU states agreed on the basics of the new sanctions package against Russia on Thursday. According to information from EU circles, it is aimed at the areas of energy, finance and transport. In addition, there should be export checks for high-tech products and software, as well as restrictions on visa policies. An exclusion of Russia from the banking communication network SWIFT and export bans on natural gas, for example, were initially not planned. However, it's considered quite possible in EU circles that there will be an expulsion from SWIFT at a later date and that Russia itself will stop supplying the EU with natural gas. According to the EU Commission, the Russian state-owned company Gazprom has so far supplied around 30% of the gas consumed in the EU. According to the information, the main purpose of the sanctions against the financial sector is to cut off banks from the EU financial markets. In the future, they should no longer be able to borrow or lend money in the EU. In addition, the refinancing of Russian state-owned companies in the EU should be prevented. Their shares will no longer be traded in the EU. Something similar is planned for the energy sector. The main purpose of the sanctions against the transport sector is to cut off the supply of spare parts and other technology to the Russian aviation industry. This could have a huge impact with relatively little effort and even shut down entire fleets, it said on Thursday in Brussels. The export checks for high-tech products and software are intended to make it difficult for other key Russian industries to develop further. The country could be hit hard in the medium and long term, it said in Brussels. At the same time, it was emphasized that the point was not to hit Russian citizens. The punitive measures are aimed at those who support Putin's aggressive policies. Former US President Donald Trump, who's locked out of Twitter and Facebook, is trying to establish his own online platform for his supporters. The Twitter alternative developed by Trump's media group, Truth Social, appeared in the American App Store for Apple's iPhone on Monday. Trump announced the platform in October to defy the tyranny of big tech companies. The 75-year-old social media activities are of particular importance given the speculation about a possible candidacy in the US presidential election in 2024. However, users had problems at the start. The app could be downloaded on Monday. It was also possible to set up an account. However, reference was then made to a waiting list, allegedly due to high demand. "We love you and we're not just a number to us, but your number on the waiting list is below," it said. On the website of the Trump Media and Technology Group, the company behind the new platform, a video shows what Truth Social should look like. In it, it looks like the platform is similar to Twitter. The head of Trump's media group, TMTG, Devin Nunes, told Fox News on Sunday that the goal is to have Truth Social fully operational by the end of March. After the announcement in autumn, the service was initially tested on a small scale. Facebook and especially Twitter were Trump's main communication channels for years, but he lost access after supporters stormed the Capitol in Washington on January 6th in 2021. The decisive factor was that Trump had expressed sympathy for the attackers. He also continues to claim, without any evidence whatsoever, that his victory in November's presidential election was stolen through fraud. He heated up the mood in the country. Twitter sees no going back for the ex-president, who has had more than 80 million followers on the platform. Trump is initially banned from Facebook until early 2023. Google's video platform YouTube does not rule out his return, but does not give a time frame for it. After Trump was kicked out of the most important social media, Trump and his supporters made several attempts to build a relevant alternative to Twitter and co. In May, Trump launched a blog on his website. There, the former president mainly complained about alleged fraud in the 2020 presidential elections. The blog area was closed again after a month. Trump now communicates, among other things, via his spokeswoman Liz Harrington on Twitter, who regularly publishes messages from the ex-president there. According to a report, Belarusian President Lukashenko, the dictator, is calling for a nuclear-capable missile system to be stationed in his country in the middle of the Ukraine war. He could use it to monitor the situation up to Berlin. Belarusian dictator Alexander Lukashenko apparently wants to talk to Russian President Vladimir Putin in the coming days about the possible deployment of Iskander and S-400 missile systems in Belarus. The missiles of the Iskander system can also be equipped with nuclear warheads. The talks were supposed to take place on Thursday or Friday, Lukashenko told the state-run Belarusian news agency Belta on Thursday. After consultations with his military, he was convinced that missile systems would make sense so that we can actually monitor the situation all the way to Berlin, said Lukashenko. Iskander and S-400 defense systems would be the strongest deterrent, Lukashenko said. Not only are the people in Ukraine and the West horrified by the Russian invasion, there's also great outcry in Russia itself. In the evening on Thursday, there were supposed to be protests for peace across the country, and there were. The opposition in Russia has reacted with sharp criticism and called for nationwide protest against the army's invasion of neighboring Ukraine. On Thursday, they said, "Today at 7 p.m. in the centers of our cities, Russians are against war." It was written by the Moscow-based activist Marina Litvinovich. "We will clean up this mess in the coming years, not only us but also our children and grandchildren," she wrote. In the meantime, Litvinovich has been arrested by the police, as she told the Reuters news agency on Telegram. "I was arrested on the way home," she said. Jailed Kremlin critic Alexei Navalny also sharply criticized the attack on Ukraine. "I'm against this war," he said, according to the independent Russian news media Dozhd. "The war between Russia and Ukraine is a maneuver by the Kremlin to distract attention from domestic problems in Russia." Navalny made the comments during a criminal case against him in the penal camp east of Moscow, where he has been detained for over a year. The best-known Putin critic warned of the devastating effects of the conflict. This will lead to a large number of victims and destroyed plans for the future, and will further exacerbate the impoverishment of the citizens of Russia. Navalny wrote on Twitter, "Putin and his senile robbers are the enemies of Russia and its greatest threat, not Ukraine and the West. Putin kills, and he wants to keep killing." The Kremlin critic Mikhail Khodorkovsky spoke of a betrayal of Russian interests. "We must be clear that it is Putin and his entourage who started the war to stay in power, not the Russian people," Khodorkovsky said. "Everything must be done to end the war." The once richest man in Russia was imprisoned for tax evasion from 2003 to 2013, and the Kremlin smashed his oil company Yukos. Khodorkovsky now lives in London with his family. Ukraine has asked Turkey to close the Bosphorus and Dardanelles. Ankara has not yet responded. However, President Erdogan expressed his support for Ukraine and criticized Moscow. Ukrainian ambassador to Ankara, Vasil Bodnar, has asked Turkey to block access to the Bosphorus and Dardanelles straits for Russian ships. "We have forwarded our demands to Turkey," the ambassador said during a press conference in Ankara. The straits connect the Mediterranean Sea with the Black Sea. Bodnar also called on Ankara on Thursday to close its airspace, impose sanctions on Russia, and confiscate Russian assets in Turkey. Ankara did not react for the time being. Turkey has sovereignty over the Bosphorus and Dardanelles straits. Merchant ships of all countries have free passage in peacetime. There are limitations on naval ships that can be increased in times of war. For example, countries bordering the Black Sea must give Turkey 8 days' notice if they want to send ships through the straits. For all other countries, the lead time is 15 days. The passage is limited and the ships may not stay longer than 21 days in the region. Russia uses the Turkish straits to allow ships to sail between the Mediterranean and Black Seas. NATO member Turkey has maritime borders with both countries in the Black Sea. Earlier this month, 6 Russian warships and a submarine passed through the Bosphorus and Dardanelles straits to take part in a military exercise in the Black Sea near Ukrainian waters. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan made the statement after a phone call with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyj. Erdogan rejected the Russian invasion and expressed his support for Ukraine in its fight for territorial integrity. Turkey regards both Ukraine and Russia as friendly countries and hopes that the problems will be solved through dialogue. Erdogan said last month Turkey was ready to do whatever is necessary to prevent war. At the same time, Turkey on Thursday advised its people living in Ukraine to stay indoors or in a safe place and avoid travel after flights were cancelled due to the closure of Ukraine's airspace. NATO fears that Russia could also attack the Baltic member states in the future. The now activated defense plan allows the dispatch of intervention troops and a bit more. In view of the Russian attack on Ukraine, NATO activates defense plans for Eastern Europe. The commander-in-chief of the NATO armed forces thus has far-reaching powers, for example, to request and relocate troops. The German press agency learned this from alliance circles. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said on Thursday, after emergency meeting of the 30 NATO ambassadors in Brussels, that activating the plans would also allow the NATO Response Force, the NRF, to be deployed in an emergency to protect member countries. It includes up to 40,000 soldiers. "This is a deliberate, cold-blooded and long-planned invasion," Stoltenberg said of the Russian attack. "We now have a war in Europe on a scale and in a way that we thought that was a thing of the past," he said. "NATO will do everything to protect its territory," said the Secretary General. More than 100 fighter jets are on alert to monitor NATO airspace. A statement from the 30 member states said, "We have decided to take additional steps to further strengthen deterrence and defense across the alliance. All measures are and will remain preventive, proportionate, and not escalating." In view of the tensions with Russia, the NATO commander-in-chief in Europe had already drastically reduced the standby times for tens of thousands of alliance soldiers last week. According to information from the German press agency from NATO circles, forces of the NRF Rapid Reaction Force must now be able to be deployed within just 7 days instead of 30. A so-called notice to move period of 30 days instead of 45 applies to other units. A few weeks ago, the commander-in-chief had increased the notice to move period for the VJTF, the fastest reaction force. This means that the associated soldiers currently have to be ready for a transfer to a crisis area within a maximum of 5 days. The VJTF would be the first force to be deployed at the eastern flank. The heads of state and government of the NATO countries met on Friday afternoon for a special session on Russia's war against Ukraine. Russia and China have supplied the military in Myanmar with weapons of the type used against civilians since the coup, according to a UN human rights expert. When the delivery was made, both countries must have been aware that the junta would use it against their own peoples, writes Tom Andrews, the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Myanmar. He called on the Security Council for a special session on Tuesday to ban such arms shipments by resolution. He submitted his report to the UN Human Rights Council, which begins its spring session on Monday in Geneva. Russia and China are permanent members of the UN Security Council. They can prevent the adoption of resolutions there. The UN General Assembly passed a resolution last June ending arms sales to Myanmar. It should be undeniable that weapons used to kill civilians should no longer be shipped to Myanmar, said Andrews, an associate professor at Yale University Law School. The first thing to stop the junta's atrocities is to block their access to weapons. The longer the world hesitates, the more innocent people, including children, will die in Myanmar. According to him, Russia and China have supplied fighter jets and armored vehicles, among other things. Russia has also promised further arms deliveries. Serbia has authorized the export of missiles and artillery. According to the Special Rapporteur, prior to the coup, Pakistan, Belarus and Ukraine supplied weapons of the type used against civilians. Other shipments that could be used against civilians came from India, Israel and South Korea. Since the February 1st coup in 2021, Myanmar has descended into chaos and violence. Since then, according to Andrews, the military has killed more than 1,500 people, arrested at least 12,000, and forcibly displaced 440,000 from their homes. There is clear evidence that the junta has committed war crimes and crimes against humanity. After more than 100 weeks of closure due to the corona pandemic, Australia celebrated the arrival of the first tourists with great jubilation. Anyone who has been vaccinated at least twice can go on holiday again in the longed-for destination of many, for example, Germans. They don't have to be in quarantine either. At the airport in Sydney, the largest city, it said in large letters, "Welcome back, world." And Prime Minister Scott Morrison said, "My message to tourists around the world is, pack your bags, come and have one of the greatest experiences imaginable." I still dream of a trip to Australia, by the way. Whether the mighty Red Rock Uluru Inland, the Sydney Opera House or the Great Barrier Reef, Australia has unique attractions. According to the Tourism Australia Tourist Office, 9.5 million visitors came in 2019, who flushed the equivalent of 28 billion euros into the coffers. Since Corona, the industry has been practically idle. Morrison bluntly called out to guests, "Don't forget to bring your money because you'll find plenty of ways to spend it." Down Under had closed the borders for 704 days. No other Western country pursued such a strict isolationist strategy. The measures were also draconian within the country. The metropolis of Melbourne was in lockdown for more than 260 days. Qantas airline chief Alan Joyce said it was a great day for everyone in the tourism industry, and he means the opening, of course. But experts believe it will take time for the sector to recover. Emotional scenes played out at the airports. Many Australians were also separated from relatives and friends abroad for 2 years. At the gates, passengers were greeted by employees dressed in kangaroo costumes. There were also plush koalas and the typical Australian spread Vegemite as gifts. If it's the same as the other mite, I will hate it too, I'm sure. The first machine to land in Sydney came from Los Angeles and also united the Australian Jodie with her best friend from the USA, as reported by the broadcaster 9 News. The woman had postponed her wedding 4 times to allow the guest from America to attend. Now it should finally be ready in 3 days. In Adelaide, in the south of the country, a couple who had not seen each other since early 2020 and who had become engaged from a distance during that time threw their arms around each other. "So many tears at Adelaide Airport this morning," tweeted one reporter. Grandfathers and grandchildren, mothers and sons, siblings and lovers could finally hug each other again. A total of 56 machines were expected on the first day. More than 1.2 million people worldwide already have visas for Australia, Morrison said. The Qantas Group alone wants to bring 14,000 passengers to the fifth continent this week. New arrivals must now take a PCR or antigen test within the first 24 hours of arrival. Despite being vaccinated, they are not allowed to use public transport to get to their accommodation. Anyone who is unvaccinated and wants to go to Australia must apply for an exemption and be in hotel quarantine upon arrival. Other countries are now also relaxing entry restrictions. In Israel, for example, unvaccinated tourists will be allowed into the country from March 1st without a special permit. Then a PCR test before departure and one after arrival is sufficient. In Colombia, the Constitutional Court has allowed abortion up to the 24th week of pregnancy. The court announced this in a statement. Previously, the termination of pregnancies in the South American country was only allowed in special cases, such as after rape, the fetus was unable to survive, or if the life of the mother was in danger. It is estimated that around 400,000 clandestine abortions were performed there each year. After the 24th week of pregnancy, the previous reasons for legal abortions continue to apply. We celebrate this verdict as a historic victory for the women's movement in Colombia, which has been fighting for decades to have their rights recognized, said Amnesty International's regional director, Erika Guevara Rosas. It's another example of the unstoppable progress of the Green Wave in Latin America. Green Wave or Green Shawls are the distinguishing feature of the campaign for legal and safe and free abortions. In Argentina, a law liberalizing abortion up to the 14th week of pregnancy was passed at the end of 2020. In most other Latin American countries, which also are Christian, abortions are only permitted in exceptional cases. Ecuador last week passed legislation allowing abortion after rape. In Chile, a law to liberalize abortion failed at the end of last year for the time being. They are only legal in Latin American countries such as Uruguay, Cuba, Guyana, French Guiana, and parts of Mexico. In El Salvador, abortion is strictly forbidden and punishable by imprisonment. Even miscarriages are subject to severe penalties. Surrounded by acrid sour stench and mud, dozens of day laborers surrounded the garbage trucks, many of them children with dirt-smeared faces. I have to work here to earn money and help my family, says a 7-year-old boy at a garbage dump near the coast of Lebanese capital Beirut. In search of some plastic or metal scrap, the garbage collectors often put their lives in danger, close to heavy machinery. It's not uncommon for drivers and refuse collectors to quarrel. The scenes that are playing out there are the latest example of the immense economic crisis in the country. Now the poorest even fight to get rid of the waste to earn some money. Garbage is also piling up in the streets, and young men are rummaging through bins for recyclables. Lebanon is suffering from the worst economic and financial crisis in its history, exacerbated by the corona pandemic and the devastating explosion in the port of Beirut in August 2020. The state lacks money, while many Lebanese complain about the corruption of the political elite. Around 3/4 of the population now live in poverty. Waste separation also no longer works properly after the facilities responsible for this were destroyed in the harbor explosion. Since then, the garbage trucks have simply dumped the waste in landfills. Walid Boussat, finance manager of the private waste disposal company Ramco, complains about the situation. His drivers feel threatened by garbage collectors at the landfill. The conflicts do not seem to have the authorities, or the authorities don't have the conflicts under control. And plagued by the financial crisis, the state stopped paying the company money for a long time. You spend most of your time chasing your money while the central bank lies to you, the manager says. We are definitely not able to continue our operations, he explains. Government officials say the hands of the authorities are tied by the financial crisis. Meanwhile, Lebanon's Environment Minister Nasser Yassin is hoping for support from the World Bank to repair destroyed facilities, as he told the German press agency when asked. "We engaged in endless discussions and negotiations to keep the system running," he said. Activists complain that the garbage crisis has long since become an environmental problem. They make serious allegations against both the government and private companies. The corrupt governments were only interested in signing a contract with a private contractor that served their interests and not those of the public, complains activist Raja Nujaim. They were just unprofessional, dysfunctional, and only interested in making money for their own pockets. Former US President Donald Trump is convinced that Russia would not have attacked Ukraine with him as head of state in the White House. "There are good reasons why this has not happened in the past 4 years," Trump said in a telephone interview with Fox News on Wednesday evening. Russian President Vladimir Putin saw the weakness of his successor Joe Biden's US government and took advantage of it, Trump said. Trump got along fantastic with Putin. Trump also said he assumes that Putin originally did not want a war. "The way it started, I really don't think that's what he wanted to do initially. I think he wanted to do something and negotiate. Then it got worse and worse and worse," he said. Then he saw the weakness shown by the chaotic US withdrawal from Afghanistan and acted. Trump added that as president he got along fantastic with Putin, even though he took action against the German-Russian Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Just asking, who started the Afghanistan thing? During his tenure, critics have always accused Trump of soft-talking about Putin. And with him in charge, we would be in a much worse situation right now. Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has withdrawn the current state of emergency in his country because of the trucker protests that have been going on for weeks. "The situation is no longer an emergency," Trudeau said at a news conference. The Emergencies Act was applied for the first time in Canada's history last Monday on February 14th to counter the ongoing and sometimes violent actions by opponents of the corona pandemic. The protests were triggered by vaccination requirements for truck drivers. Most recently, blockades and protests in the capital in Ottawa were broken up. Life had returned to normal. A journalist has been killed during a demonstration in Haiti. According to media reports, the reporter from an online portal was shot dead on Wednesday while reporting on a protest by textile workers in the capital, Port-au-Prince. Accordingly, 2 other journalists were shot. The Caribbean state's interim Prime Minister Ariel Henry wrote on Twitter that he regretted the journalist's death and condemned the violence that caused injuries. Several media reports blamed the police for the shooting. According to the newspaper Le Nouveiste, heavily armed and hooded men fired into the crowd from a car. The news agency RHI News reported that it was a patrol car. The police had reportedly used tear gas against the demonstrators. Hundreds of people took part in the demonstration, where workers demanded a minimum wage of 1,500 gourd, that's about 13 euros a day. On Monday, the government announced an increase in the daily minimum wage in the textile industry from 500 to 685 gourds after weeks of protests.